Hi, it's Lee from ColouringQueen.net and I hope you're doing well today. I've been okay, had a bit of the sniffles, but that's because despite living in a subtropical climate, it's been so cold. I have to actually rug up in jackets and scarves just to take Buddy for a walk, and it's taken days to dry the washing. But soon I'll be complaining about the heat, I guess. That's the way the weather goes. So I've been redoing my colouring cave now that we're staying in Queensland as well. I took all my shelves out, so now I just have a desk and a small bookcase. And it's really such a small room here that it was just so cluttered and uncomfortable for me when Buddy and Millie were in here. So unfortunately all the shelves have left holes in the walls, so there's going to be a full-on plaster and paint party hopefully this weekend to get that all tidied up again. And I don't know about you guys, but it just does my head in when there's so much stuff in a small space. I can't focus and think, and it just drives me insane. I'd love to know if you are the same way as well. It does make it a bit difficult though, because now I have to go searching in the garage every time I want a book or something, and because I thought we were moving, I packed everything up. But at least I hadn't packed the art supplies, so they're easy to find because I put them in the wardrobe of the spare room, and we'll see how long that sort of lasts with them being in there. So today I've done something monumental for me. I finally cracked open my Animal Fantasy season colouring book to colour for my Hello Christmas colour along. And I love this book so much. It's from Japan and I've loved it ever since I got it. And when Amazon Japan stopped shipping to Australia, I made sure I bought another one before they brought that in. So I've got 2 copies of it. So I'm hoping if I mess up here, I can fix everything in the new book, one day. But anyway, I'm using my Prismacolors today and I've written down the colours on a piece of paper, and this is going to be a bit of challenge for me, this picture, because I'm pretty sure I've never coloured snow, so I don't know whether we'll get to it today, but I'll give it a crack when it happens and we'll see what happens. But if not, I've still got that spare book, so that's what I'm hoping, If it's too bad, I can always have a do-over in the spare book. So today I thought for the colour and story that I would tell you how a man got a house for free. Now, this is not the only time that this has happened, but I chose this story because it's just a more recent one. It also does not apply to just houses, but it can apply to all sorts of land. And of course, bear in mind that the laws may be different where you live though, so you might not get a house for free. And this one was in New South Wales, Australia. And as always, the particular circumstances of each case always apply. So let's begin the story. So there was a man named Henry Downer, and he purchased a property at 6 Malini Street in Ashbury, and that's a suburb of Sydney in the what's classed as the inner west, in 1927. Now, he lived in the property with his wife and children until just before World War II, and at that time he moved the family out to another property in the nearby suburb of Ashfield, which is kind of adjoining to it. And the reason for moving was that Mr. Downey felt that the house was full of white ants or termites, and those little critters love to eat through timber, and they basically often destroy wall frames and parts of houses if left untreated. Now, I'm sure at some stage he must have fixed this up because the story does progress. But anyway, the family lived in the nearby suburb, and they never actually returned to live in this house. At some stage, he actually rented it out to a lady called Phyllis Grimes, and she paid rent on what was an old form of rental that we had in Australia, sort of post-World War II, where people just paid a very small amount of rent. So I won't bore you with all the details of that because it no longer really exists. So Mr. Downey then died in 1947, and he left his wife and children, but there was actually no evidence that he'd ever made a will or a will was found. And so when there's no will, letters of administration should be sought. So Usually that would be his wife, and she would ask to be appointed as administrator. And that basically gives someone the right to deal with the assets of the deceased. So we know he had a house, so that would be one asset. But it seems that this wasn't done either. So then it falls to the government or the public trustee in Australia. And, that's not really the best solution because they do charge for everything. Anyway, Phyllis Grimes continued to live in this Maleny Street property and paid rent until shortly before her death, when I believe she was moved to a hospital prior to her death on the 19th of April 1998. Now, there's a bit of confusion as to what happened next, with some people believing that further tenants occupied the property and some that the property was vacant for months or a year between tenants. But what is known is that a man called Bill Gertis noticed the property. And Bill Gertis was an accountant, and he also had a bit of a dabble in real estate. And he noticed the property in Maleny Street when he was visiting clients and he was doing their tax returns. And it looked to him like no one was living there, and it looked like it needed some work done on it as it wasn't being maintained. So he took an interest in the property and noticed the next time he was in the street that it still looked empty. So he asked his clients who lived in that street what they knew about the house, and they told him that an elderly lady, Mrs. Grimes, had lived in the house for many years, but she'd either moved out or passed away. They didn't really know for sure, and since then the property had been vacant. So Bill Gertis decided that the property was in fact vacant and unoccupied in 1998. And he asked his solicitor to make some inquiries as to who the owner was and whether probate in the event the owner was deceased had been granted. And in New South Wales we can do this by searching the records. So it's a pretty easy thing to search for land. Anyway, he did that and really couldn't, bring much more to the party. And the solicitors' firms didn't seem to keep the records going back this far, so that doesn't really add to our story. Anyway, in the meantime, Bill decided that he'd go to the property and have a look-see around. So he knocked on the front door, there was no answer, called out, no answer. And that confirmed to him that there was no one in occupation of the home. So he decided to have a wander about and see what the overall condition of the property was. He found the back door had been removed from the property, and it was actually sitting next to the opening for the door. And the house was actually open if you entered through the back door. Inside, the house was a bit of a mess. It was dark and smelly. The electricity wasn't turned on, although the water was. Windows were open. Some broken windows were there as well. There was rubbish. There was broken furniture, a dirty mattress, empty tins of food, paper, and other things laying around. The bathroom was dirty and had a bit of an odour to it. The roof was leaking in a couple of places, and the house had that smell of having been unoccupied for some time. And it appeared that the house had been used by squatters at some point. Now, there was nothing in the house to identify who the previous occupants were. There was no mail built up or nothing inside, no old letters or anything. So you couldn't figure out who the previous occupants were and who'd left the rubbish behind. The front door was locked from the inside, but Bill couldn't get it undone. He tried, and he also tried to open it from the outside, but he couldn't get it open that way either. So he decided that the property was indeed vacant and he would take possession of it. Now, he knew from his solicitor and a previous workmate that it was possible to do this under the law of adverse possession, or what's often called squatters' rights. And under this law, generally you need to occupy the property to the exclusion of all others for at least 12 years to acquire rights under adverse possession. And of course, the true owner would have a higher right to claim the property prior to the expiration of that time. So in that time, you need to basically care for the home as if it's yours. or land if that's the situation. In that time, you need to pay all the bills for the property. You need to look after it as if you owned it. And so after the expiry of 12 years, you can then apply to the Register General to be registered as the owner of the property. And as the owner, of course, you can mortgage it, you can sell it, you can do whatever you fancy. So the next day, Bill returned and he forced the front door open with his shoulder. He'd already hired a builder who was with him, and his job was to get the house fixed up. Fix the leaks, secure it by replacing the back and front doors because one was missing and one wouldn't open, and install new locks and give Bill the keys. So the builder proceeded to make those repairs, and he ended up spending about $35,000 on it in 1998. That's quite a considerable amount of money. So he also started to pay the bills for the property, the council rates, the water rates, and land tax, which is payable in Australia on a property that you are not residing in. And once the repairs were made, as landlord, not owner, he rented the property out through a local estate agent. Now, he didn't have any records to support this for the first few years of the lease arrangement, though, and neither did the real estate agent. Now, depending when he took possession, Bill Gertis could have lodged his application in 2010 or 2011, depending on when he actually took possession. It's a bit murky on that. But he didn't. He had some personal matters occupying his mind, going through some family law matters. So in 2014, the property was still rented out, but it then needed a few more repairs. So over this time, Bill spent another $100,000 on it, just making more repairs. And then finally in 2017, so Bill had the property for at least 18 years by now, he applied to become the registered owner under the law of adverse possession, on the basis that he had uninterrupted possession of the property or land for a period of 12 years or more. And when he lodged the application, the remaining family of Mr. Downey were notified. Now, Mr. Downey actually had one surviving daughter, Joyce, and she was in her 90s by then, and a couple of granddaughters. Now, as there was no probate, what's done when you have a will and it gets sent to court in New South Wales, or letters of administration when you don't have a will, the family had no idea that Henry Downey still owned the house at Ashbury, because they'd been living in the next suburb in a house in Queen Street. So they didn't realise. And when you put in the probate work to the court, it lists out all the assets. The legal representative or the executor or the administrator goes through and works out all the assets so that it can be divided up in accordance with the wishes of the will. But because there wasn't one and there was no letters of administration, it seems like it just slipped through the cracks. And so this was the first time that they'd heard that the family home was still registered in Mr. Downey's name, their father and grandfather. And they didn't even know this until a policeman apparently knocked on their door in 2017, that they realised that the family home was still in his name. So, most people, have some idea of assets, or if you know that someone's deceased but you're not sure of the assets, we can do searches, etc., to find out things that are in their name or a name associated with them and variations of the name and things like that. It's, pretty easy searches to do. And if you're unsure if they've left a will or not, we can do advertisements looking for the will and asking law firms, etc. But because this just seemed to slip through the cracks, really. Anyway, the family claimed to be the rightful owners of the house, and they applied for an injunction at court, which basically an injunction is to stop doing something. So what they wanted to do is stop the registration of the property into Bill Gertis's name while they fought it out. Now, they had a few reasons or arguments for this. They said that they were entitled to the land through that whole law of intestacy, when people die, as they were the daughter and the granddaughters of the original registered owner. And they also argued that Bill Gertis' acquisition of the property was not open, which is part of the law that needs to be satisfied to assert squatters' rights in New South Wales. And that as the original owner was deceased, the limitation period, that 12 years, should have been suspended on a basis of a disability. So the matter was heard over 2 days in October of 2018, and the court rejected all of the family's argument. They found that even though Bill Gertis rented the property out and he didn't live in it himself, he had invested his money in improving the property. He'd secured it by putting those doors on and the locks. He'd paid the bills like council, water rates and land tax. And he'd leased it out. And during that time, his possession or ability to do that wasn't interrupted. No one came in and said, hey, this is my house, or hey, I've got a better claim to it than you. So the court found he did have the required intent to possess the property, and he had sufficiently shown that he continually possessed the property over well beyond that limitation period. Because as I said, he only needed 12 years, and he put in his claim in when he'd had the property for at least 18. So all of the things Bill Gertis did, the court was satisfied in the way in which an owner would also act. And the court ordered that the injunction lodged by the family be removed and Bill Gertis be registered as the owner in 2018. So the court also ordered that the family paid Bill Gertis's legal costs, which would have been quite considerable for a 2-day hearing in court. Now, according to his lawyer, Bill Gertis had offered the family $300,000 to settle out of court, but they rejected that offer. And the sad thing is, if the family had made their claim within that 12-year period, it's highly likely that they would have been successful, and the money that Bill Gertis had spent on repairing the property, like the $150,000, would have been a loss, and he would have had to wear that. In all fairness, he was renting out the property, and I think about this time it was about $550 a week, but still that's like $25,000 minus agent's commission, minus rates, etc. So he might have made the money back in rental income, but he'd still spent out all of that money initially and during the time for repairs, etc. So the family appealed the decision, but they withdrew the appeal just prior to the court date in June 2019. And Bill Gertis's lawyer said to the media at the time that they weren't going to pursue the family for the costs order that was made against them, but they would have still been up for their own legal fees. Now, I don't know if this ever happened or not, whether they did end up paying his costs, because that's a private matter. It's not listed in the public records. But they would have still had substantial legal fees of their own. So all up, all pretty sad, really. By 2019, Bill Gertis became the registered owner, and that court order went through doing that. And after about 6 months or so, he sold the house for $1.4 million. So there's a few lessons to be learned here, I guess. Always have a will, even if you think that you don't have anything worth leaving. It's important to have someone to be the legal representative of your estate, to go through your assets and your liabilities and sort out your underwear drawer and, all of those things. Otherwise, no one has authority. And if you don't have it, then, in New South Wales, the government will take over as public trustee, and their fees will be quite significant. And make sure your will is kept in a safe place, preferably with your solicitor that's made it for you. They have fireproof safes that withstand heat of, I think it's 90, I might be wrong, to make sure that they're kept safe, and make sure you don't leave your house or a land abandoned for any length of time. And this includes land. So my stepfather was a farmer, and I was always saying to him, because he'd tell me one of these stories about how one of his mates lost a parcel of their land because they let the guy next door run their cattle on it for 20 years and never complained. And I say, well, yeah, squatters' rights, they're entitled to it. But he would always be outraged about it, that could happen. But, if there's no lease in place or license or right to use it, then people could make this sort of claim. Even if it's like in Sydney, for example, there's a lot of land behind people's houses that were for the old waste removal septic tanks, and they're called dunny lanes. It's sort of pretty self-explanatory. The horse and cart used to go down there and take out, the waste from the properties. Those dunny lanes are always subject to these sorts of claims because we don't have that anymore in Sydney, and someone ends up putting up a fence, so excluding all others, and then they end up extending their garden out there onto this piece of land. So, it can be land, it can be houses, all sorts of things. And so just be aware of it, that people could claim on it and you could lose. This is particularly relevant in farming communities, although this case I've told you about is in a suburb. But in farming communities, in my experience, a lot of people just do handshake deals, as my stepfather would have done, and they just let their neighbours use a bit of land, and before you know it, 20 years, 12 years have passed and they think it's theirs. So I'd love to know what you think about the case, if you think that the family should have got the house, or if you think Bill shouldn't have got it. I'd love to know. Bill was well aware of adverse possession because he, had a mate that had, had the same experience, and he'd also got advice from his solicitor prior to keep the property for at least 12 years and up to 14, his solicitor advised him, which is probably good because those first few years Bill wasn't really able to produce the evidence, the records, and I think he'd had a number of properties and all his receipts and things like that were kind of a bit intermingled. So it was hard to work out which repairs were for which property type thing. And I don't think the estate agent kept records, and it seems like the law firm didn't have any records. So, it was probably a good move that he waited longer than the 12 years, as he couldn't really substantiate those first few years anyway. But as always, I'd love to know what you think. He sold the place for $1.4 million. So if you take out, what he spent on it and the costs over the years, and then add in the rental, pretty good deal, pretty sweet deal. But, of course you add in the legals, etc. But yeah, pretty good deal for just finding a house on the street, and making it your own. There's been lots of these cases, and as I said, a lot of them relate to farming communities, but there's been quite a few of those little laneway cases, especially in the Sydney area. They're the ones I'm more familiar with. But yeah, this was a recent one, so 2018-19, so pretty recent in the world of law. But as always, I'd love to know what you think. And of course, the laws might be different in your country. I believe the UK is significantly different. Don't really know about the US, so I can't really comment on that. And as always, although they might be similar, you have to get to the detail, the nitty-gritty of it to make sure that you satisfy those requirements. So, just make sure you're always looking to those sorts of things in the detail. So I'm probably going to finish, do another layer on this picture, because I put the first one down, and I usually do that pretty lightly, in case I make a mistake, it makes it really easier to rub it out. So I'll probably do another layer, and I'll probably do the snow in the next video. And yeah, we'll see how we go with that. I'm really nervous about the snow. And yeah, I'm really not sure, but I'm glad I've got the spare book just in case, because I can see mistakes being made here, but I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But at least I'm feeling like colouring again. Like last week, I just made so many mistakes in all my beautiful books, and then had to do a colour by number picture because I was just so frustrated and just so over it, and just mistakes central everywhere. Now I've got all these half done pictures in books everywhere that one day I'm going to have to go back and finish. I'm going to have to do one of those work in progress challenges, I think, to get it done. So anyway, my next colour along for August is Animals in August 2022. So I hope that you guys join in a colour along, either the Animals in August or the Hello Christmas 2022 colour along. I'm going to try and colour a Halloween picture as well. I seen one in one of Clara Makova's books, and it was as cute as a button, although it was a skeleton in a coffin, but it was still as cute as a button. But I'd like to give that one a whirl, but I'm a bit nervous about colouring in my Clara book because I made a mess of a couple of pictures the other day when I was frustrated and couldn't work out what I wanted to do and what I wanted to colour. And yeah, I don't know if you guys ever get that, but I just felt I couldn't colour anything and everything was just a mess and it looked horrible. And so I don't know really how I'm going to fix it. But anyway, that's a problem for another day. Maybe we should actually do a video where I try and fix one of these messes and see what happens. Anyway, I hope you have a good weekend wherever you are in the world. And that's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.